Oh, Frank was one of my real discoveries in Chicago, because I knew next to nothing about him, and he was unfortunately not well represented on records at all. There were a few things where he was really not featured, but he was one of the members of the band, including something I think Marty used him in some things, but he was extraordinary, and people would always talk about him and then talk about Pee Wee, you know, because there was a kinship there, but Frank was his own, and he was special. He was really, in that idiom, one of the very best that I'd ever heard. And he had a, you know, somewhat of a fan club in Chicago. Harriet Chace was one of his great fans, Wayne Jones, Don DeMichael. Then there was also an extraordinary piano player named Bob Wright, who we will talk about a little bit, but let's concentrate on Frank right now. But Frank was extraordinary, and I got to know him, which it wasn't that easy to get to know him, but he was, as you said, I mean, he was somewhat of an eccentric, and he had very strong opinions about the music. I once played something for him by Coleman Hawkins, and he didn't like it at all. Not that he liked it. He didn't like what Hawk did with the tune. I think it was I Wish That I Were Twins. Anyway, Frank was extraordinary. He did come to New York once. There was a town hall thing, which I believe was done by Nesui Erdogan, and it was recorded by Atlantic, but there's too little of Frank, and he was not, I was at the concert, I don't think he really was comfortable, and he wasn't put in a position where he could really show what he could do. He was often mentioned in the same breath with Pee Wee and Frank Teschmacher. There was him, he was in that tradition, but he was of his own time, and he had his own thing. And I believe there is stuff, Bob Kester was a big fan of his, but it was always difficult to get Frank to record, because I think he had certain, ideas about it, and also he was a little reluctant because he didn't have control over the situation. In any case, he is somebody who I think, I would say he ranks with the best I've heard on that instrument, and I've heard many, many of them were extraordinary, but he was really something else, as they say, Frank was something else. But he was not a self-promoter, and he did have certain, things that he wanted the way he wanted them. There was a remarkable evening that I'll never forget, and I believe it was captured on records, on tape. Harriet was there, and she knows about it, but it was Frank and Bob Wright, who, like Frank, is somebody who was hardly known outside of Chicago, who was a truly remarkable pianist. I think something is in the works now to get a really representative recording out, because he did leave a lot of stuff. But Bobby was also, he had a huge collection of sheet music going back to the ragtime era, because he was a pretty good ragtime player himself, and an enormous collection of stuff. And like Frank, he was kind of a loner and somebody who had his own ideas. Was it you who gave me a thing of Ruby with Wright on piano, a live thing from Chicago?
No, I've not had that honor.
It's not too well recorded, but it's interesting, but not representative. So anyway, there was a trio of Frank and Bob and Wayne, and it was just wonderful. amazing. I'm trying to remember some other really good musicians in Chicago, but there are many, and sometimes names don't come up as well as they used to. You mentioned Bill Priestley, and there was also, Squirrel Ashcraft, I think, was gone by then. But there were people in his circle. Bill Priestley was one of them, and when Pee Wee, whom I had gotten to know in New York pretty well, thankfully, came to Chicago very near the end of his life, and stayed with Priestley, who was an old friend of his. Bill Priestley was also an architect, and a very successful one. He was one of the Ivy Leaguers who in the 20s became interested in jazz, and the real jazz, and started collecting so-called race records stuff. Bill was one of them. Squirrel was the old man among them, the one who knew everything, and who people like Marshall Stearns in their early days came to find out things, because nobody knew anything about it. Nobody knew who was in King Oliver's band. I mean, a few people did, but when people like Charles Edward Smith and Marshall began to really study the music and wanted to write about it, there was nobody to go to, but Squirrel was the guy who was in the know. Bill Priestley was a fine cornet player and also played guitar. And he was an old friend of Pee Wee's. And then I was very touched, and I still am. Pee Wee was staying with Priestley, who lived in a suburb outside Chicago. And Priestley, who didn't really know me, I had met him very casually once, but of course he knew who I was because I was downbeat, you know. But he called me and he said, Pee Wee would like to see you. Would you come out? You know, and he said, I'll pick you up. I want to come out for an afternoon and have a drink and stuff. And of course, I was floored that Pee Wee wanted to see me. And there were just the three of us and Bill's wife, I think, and I'll never forget it. And then Pee Wee left Chicago, and very shortly after that, he was gone. Pee Wee was, there were a lot of people who, you know, looked at Pee Wee as kind of a humorous figure, you know, all that. And he was really a very serious guy.
Now you go back with him to maybe the late 40s, the early 50s in New York to see Pee Wee?
What?
When did you first encounter Pee Wee in person?
In person? Well, I saw him live not too long after I came to New York in '47. I think it would have been, it was in the Village, and it may very well have been at Nick's, although it may have listening outside of Nick's, because Nick's was too expensive for me. There are a lot of people. And Nick's was specialized in the sizzling steaks. That was what that, and the steaks you could smell from the outside, but you could also hear the music. You could stand on the sidewalk. You could do that on 52nd Street too. But that's probably where I first heard Pee Wee live. But I don't know how we became friendly. Oh, it was a gradual thing. And then when I was doing the concerts at the Museum of Modern Art, the chance to, and also through Bobby, Pee Wee and Bobby Hackett were very close friends. And I got to, and Mary liked me, and that was important, because if Mary was Pee Wee's wife, if Mary liked you, you could, you know, come to the house and visit and so on. If she didn't like it, forget about it. You know. And she made no bones about who she liked and who she didn't like. I'll tell you one little thing about Pee Wee, who had by then had begun to paint. You know how he started to paint?
Mary bought him a painting.
No, Mary felt that he was not, he was sitting at home and not doing anything with himself. So for some reason she was at Macy's and she saw there was a sale on a complete paint set of canvases and paints and brushes and everything. So she bought it and she came home and she dumped it in Pee Wee's lap and she said, "Here, do something." Oddly enough, miraculously, he picked this up, and he'd never been to a museum. He wasn't interested. He knew his friend George Wettling was a fine painter, but he'd never been to a museum and looked at any paintings or anything like that. But he started to paint, and there's a film about that. I don't know if you've seen it. He had a remarkable technique. It was totally his own thing, the way he got the paints out of the tube, the way he used brushes. And the paintings are wonderful. They were sort of abstract, although they all had names that gave it a specific, center, but it was abstract. The Institute of Jazz Studies has more than 30 of these. They have been exhibited occasionally, but I wish they would do more with them. Hank O'Neill and Hank O'Neill had a friend who's still around, name goes, a rich man who partially got the chiaroscuro label started and stuff.
Andrew Sordoni?
Yeah, that's it. And there was an exhibit of Pee Wee and Wettling paintings, and Hank and I wrote respectively about them, a little catalog thing. But Pee Wee was extraordinary. And, people think of him as a character, but he was a fully fledged human being, there was no. Dick Wellsted, when Pee Wee died, Dick sent me a little thing about him, which is the most beautiful, just a couple of paragraphs. And, Pee Wee was deep. But one of the things that I remember, because it got to, have an impact on me, etc. I always liked the records Pee Wee made with Louis Prima. And I liked the print. They were absolutely not mentioned usually, and still today aren't among collectors and people who write about. They're wonderful records, but I think because Prima later on became as popular as he did, and they associate him with certain things like, he was always a really good trumpet player. And in those days, when they made those records, he was really fine, and Prima was really the guy who brought jazz to 52nd Street. That was it. At the famous store, he was the first one, and with Pee Wee and the band. But anyway, I brought that up with Pee Wee, and he not only said that he agreed that those were, he didn't like a lot of his own records, but like most musicians, But he also said that working with Prima, he said, those were the happiest days in my life as a musician, which was a remarkable thing to say. Then he told me a few anecdotes about what happened, but he also said, and Prima was a hell of a trumpet player. And of course they had a thing in those shorts where they do stuff together, where they have a conversation and all that. So anyway, I told Pee Wee that I wanted to go see Prima. He was performing at a big club in Brooklyn. I forget the name of it. It was like the Brooklyn counterpart of the Copacabana, So I was covering it for Don, and also Don wanted me to do a little interview with Prima. So I remember that his wife, Gia, it was after Keeley, and was very pregnant because she was appearing with the band, she was singing with them. And I had made an appointment with him through the club. Downbeat was still, made a consequence. But when I knocked on the door backstage, on the door of his dressing room, and he came out with a bathrobe because, you know, he worked so hard when he was performing. He worked up a sweat like the other Louis, you know. And I could tell that he was not particularly excited about having to spend part of his break between shows talking to me, because he didn't know from Adam. But I had already plotted something. When I told Pee Wee that I was going to see Prima, he said, "Oh," she said, "give him my love, you know, tell me." So the first thing I said to him after I said, "I'm sorry to disturb you," I said, I have greetings for you from Pee Wee Russell." And all of a sudden, you know, he looked rather, his face lit up, and he said, "Pee Wee?" He said, "How's that old son of a gun?" And he said, "Oh, dude." And then he said, "You know," he said, "he's the greatest musician I ever worked with in my life, you know." And he was just, after that I was in, you know, I mean, that was it. But that wasn't why I wasn't using it. I really wanted to, and I told Pee Wee later, I told him, you know, the story. But Pee Wee he was such a dear man, you know, he was, and he had his own ideas about music. He loved Bobby Hackett. That was, I did a thing with them at the museum, you know. And the moment I asked Pee Wee, "Who do you want on trumpet?" he said, "Bobby," you know, that was just like that. That's a reflex. Yeah, but that, you know, that afternoon at Priestley's, I'm so glad that happened because, you know, just a little while later, he was gone. That was a bunch, you know, the Condon gang, so to speak. I mean, there were a lot of personalities there. Wild Bill Davison, Wild Bill. He was a character. I mean, he really was. He did all kinds of things. You know, remember, sometimes he got into the big headline in the Daily News or something when he was in a cab coming back from the airport, you know, and he pulled out a gun. He didn't want to use it, but he was talking to the cab driver, and he said, "You know, I got to." The cab driver got scared, and he called the police. So they arrested him, and it got in the papers and stuff. He was also somebody who, quote unquote, borrowed things that he liked, you know, when he saw them, including some quite valuable ones. But you know who was very fond of Bill, and they were old friends, and was Zudi Singleton. And Zudi and Wild Bill together. Zudi lived at the Alvin, which is where Lester Young also lived, and musicians there. And Zudi told me that Wild Bill in Chicago really was billed as the White Louis Armstrong. And this is also the case of Louis Prima at the Apollo. At the Apollo, billed as the White Louis Armstrong. But the more interesting thing about Wild Bill, who of course was the very unfortunate thing that Frank Teschmacher got killed when he was in a car that was driven by a wife. But it wasn't Bill's fault. They were rammed by a cab that went through a red light and rammed them sideways, and that's on the side where Frank was sitting. But for many years he was persona non grata in Chicago. And he never really, he went to Milwaukee, and then he went to New York, and finally got back to Chicago. Art Hodes was one of the people who defended him, and Art actually got him remarkably, had Wild Bill as a guest on one of the shows that we did with Bob Kaiser, and he got Bill to talk about that for a few minutes. But anyway, you know, I mean, the cast of characters there. We talked about Bob Chace already, and Parenti worked for a while for Condon, and then there was Eddie himself. But did we talk about Eddie? We talked about him a bit, didn't we?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Eddie deserves his own
Yeah.
shot. So let's hold off for a second.